So thank you, Julie, for that introduction. Like she said, my project is entitled The Benefits of Abstract Word Training on Productive Vocabulary Knowledge Among Second Language Learners.
You might have to use the arrow.
So I was in Granada, Spain for 7 weeks. This was my first time traveling to Spain. And I worked at the University of Granada with Daniela Pagliari. And just to talk a little bit about my experience, it was cool collaborating with her because not only was it my first time collaborating with a professor at a different university, but it was also my first time collaborating with a professor at a different country. So that was really interesting. Just kind of see the different cultural norms that are in their lab, and working with people in the lab. And it's definitely a lot different than labs here at Penn State. Just like everybody kisses on the cheek there, which I was not expecting when I got there. And I was just like, yeah. So it was really cool, and it's a learning curve at first, fitting into the lab, but once you hit the ground running, it's really cool to be working in that different culture and just see different ways that they conduct research. And this was also my first full-time research experience, which was really cool because as a communication sciences and disorders major, there's kind of a path where you can either go to the clinical route or go into research. So being able to experience this firsthand really swayed my decision. I want to continue on to research. So it was just awesome seeing that because I have shadowed in the clinical field, so just being able to make that distinction was really awesome. And it was really different from my previous study abroad experience. There's a lot more independence. It wasn't as structured. I kind of made my own schedule. I had to be responsible for collecting participants and running participants, and making sure that I'm staying on top of data analysis and Skyping with my advisors and everything like that. So it was really, really cool for me to kind of experience that. Okay. So just a little background knowledge on my study. So obviously vocabulary acquisition is critical for L2 knowledge. And going back to Nation 2001, there's 3 dimensions of word knowledge, which is form, meaning, and use. So basically form, you have to be able to identify that a word is part of that language. Meaning, you have to be able to not only identify the word, but then attach a meaning to it. And use, which is what we're going to focus on, is being able to use it productively in conversation. So studies have shown that L2 learners struggle to develop this kind of productive vocabulary knowledge. So this focuses on abstract and concrete vocabulary. So basically, concepts are stored as either abstract or concrete. So abstracts are things that can't be experienced by the senses. For example, emergency, or it's not very imageable. There's a lot of different interpretations of it. While concrete words are things that can be experienced by the senses, so ambulance. And studies have shown that abstract words are acquired later than concrete words. And there have been studies who have looked at the difference between acquisition in abstract and concrete vocabulary, but not have actually looked at kind of generalization from abstract to concrete words, which I'll talk about in a second. So this study is based on Sandberg and Keir in 2014, which basically found that training abstract words or more complex items showed generalizations to concrete words or less complex items in monolingual patients with aphasia. And for the purpose, generalization is basically a benefit from trained items to untrained items. So abstract words to concrete words, but basically if you train abstract items, you'll get an increase in concrete items without actually training them on that. So they had 12 participants who were trained in one of the 2 categories, hospital or courthouse, with church serving as a control. And it was a multiple baseline single subject design. So basically I'll talk a little about the graph. So first you see here, there's 3 baselines, which is basically just to make sure that there's no rising baseline and that they're staying pretty constant before they're ever introduced to any stimuli. And this signifies when training begins. So you can see that once training begins, we're seeing an increase in both abstract and concrete vocabulary, and they're actually only being trained on the abstract vocabulary. And then once training ends, we see that they're actually maintaining this vocabulary in both the abstract and the concrete vocabulary. And so basically how they measured this was at the beginning of each training session, they asked them to name as many words as they could within each of the categories, so it was a productive task. And they saw similar patterns like this across their participants. So basically their study was based on the idea that semantic concepts are stored in kind of networks based on their semantic meaning. And so since they saw these patterns of increase in not only abstract vocabulary but also concrete vocabulary, it's kind of supporting the idea that they're strengthening these connections and therefore strengthening the ability to produce these words. So basically, in my study, wanted to see if we can take this training and apply it to second language learners, since it was first applied to patients with aphasia. And then we wanted to see, if we can apply this training, will we see an increase in not only abstract vocabulary but also concrete vocabulary as well within the same context category, so showing this generalization. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about methods. So we had 10 native Spanish speakers who were intermediate L2 English learners. One participant only completed the training partially, and this was a multiple baseline single subject design, so each participant acted as their own control. So each participant was trained in the category restaurant with soccer and university acting as controls. Each category consisted of 30 words, 15 abstract and 15 concrete, and these words were matched within categories and across categories just to make sure they were balanced throughout. So the training overview, it was 9 sessions, so 3 baselines, where they were just asked to produce as many words as they could within each of the categories within 2 minutes. And after the baselines were completed, they completed a semantic crowding and translation recognition task. And this was actually suggested by Daniela as a way to see if before and after training we're seeing a difference in how they're performing on these tasks. So after baselines, we then start training, where again they're probed at the beginning of each session. So probes, it's just the same thing as a baseline, except this is after they're introduced to the stimuli. And so we had at least 1 day break between training sessions. And again, the semantic crowding and translation recognition tasks were administered again after. And so all this training is done in English, but if they needed to produce in Spanish, they were allowed to. It was just preferred that they used English, since this was what we were looking at. So once again, the probes are basically just asking them to name as many words as they can within each of the training categories in 2 minutes. And then, so this is a breakdown of the training sessions, which I'll talk about each step individually. So first is the word sorting task. So they're presented with 2 categories, so restaurant and soccer, and the 60 words, so 30 from the restaurant category and 30 from the soccer category, and they're basically just asked to sort the words based on their meaning. So they just drag and drop into the boxes. And then step 2 is feature selection. So basically the participant is presented with 45 features, 17 general features, so is alive, generally considered positive, 13 participant generated features, which is done in the first training task, and 15 unrelated features, so they would not apply to any of the words. And so basically they're given a word and they have to choose the 6 best features that describe the word, and they do this for each of the 15 trained abstract words within the context category. After this, they're asked yes/no questions, so while they're going through and picking features, I'm marking it down so that after I can ask them questions, and I make sure not to use the ones that they had previously selected. And so I asked them 15 questions, in each from the 3 different featured categories. So I would turn the feature into a question. So is this a feeling or emotion? Can this be tasted? Step 4 is synonym generation. So basically I asked the participant to recall the word, decide whether the word is abstract or concrete, and then produce a synonym of the word. And finally, we have free generative naming, where basically they are asked to produce as many words as they can within the trained category. And the difference between this is that there's no time limit and prompting is allowed. So I can say, think of the words that we worked with today, and everything. So here are my results. So basically, I'll explain my graph a little bit. So before the vertical line, that signifies the baseline. So this is before they're ever introduced to the stimuli, and you can see it stays pretty constant. They're not showing any gains in vocabulary. After the vertical line, we see an increase in both abstract and concrete vocabulary. So abstract, again, is the trained items, and concrete is never trained. So we're seeing an increase in untrained items as well as trained items. And then the two control categories are staying pretty constant throughout, which we would expect. The next. So again, another participant, we're seeing even through the baseline an increase in both vocabulary during training, and then constant in the two control categories. We actually saw this same kind of pattern in both increase in abstract and concrete vocabulary in 8 out of the 10 participants. So basically, going back to my research questions, so is this training applicable to second language learners? And we found that yes, it is. We are seeing an increase in trained material, which we would expect, but also is this abstract, is this training, can we see these same generalizations that we saw in the monolingual patients with aphasia? And we see yes. Though not as prominent, we are seeing an increase in production of target concrete words within the same context category. So I'll talk about what that kind of means. So basically, going back to why this is important in L2 studies. So obviously in L2 learning situations, we have limited time to teach vocabulary. So being able to teach smaller amounts of words and see gains in other vocabulary is obviously amazing in L2 research, because it saves time and we're seeing benefits throughout. So basically, we assume that this is working because we're kind of strengthening those semantic connections in the different context categories, which is making them able to produce these words more freely. Okay, so future direction. So currently we are collecting participants from Penn State, and this is just to further support our hypothesis. We're working on analyzing the semantic priming and translation recognition tasks. And we actually, this semester, we designed and implemented a classroom study based on this training, and it was done in the intermediate German class at Penn State. So we also want to see if this is transferable to L2 learners who maybe don't have that base receptive knowledge of these words. And then we want to see if we can, what training abstract words would do if we see these generalizations and the reverse direction, so concrete to abstract, and we really don't think that will, because it's based on the idea that training complex gives you the less complex items. So I'd like to thank my advisors, Dr. Carrie Jackson, Dr. Shalice Sandberg, and Catherine Kirshen, for helping me through this project. Thank you to Dr. Daniela Pilieri and the psychology department at the University of Granada for collaborating on this project. Thank you to all the Pyre faculty, Julie, Heather, Miriam, thank you so much. You guys were so wonderful and really made this possible. And thank you to all the subjects that participated in my study.
And there is time for a couple of questions. Isabel.
I have a quick one, and you might not know the answer, but I was just wondering how you made sure that the participants actually knew the concrete words that they were implicitly trained on. So, because presumably the difference between aphasia speakers and L2 speakers is that with aphasia, you assume that the person once knew that the word for a pan is a pan. Mm-hmm. But for L2 speakers, if they haven't learned that word, how are they going to be trained on that word if they hadn't learned it in the first place? So how did you disentangle or know that the L2 participant actually knew or was trained at some point previously in the past on that word that they were supposed to use?
So during our word sorting test, they're actually presented with the concrete words in both the categories, untrained and trained categories. So if they can sort it into the correct category, we're assuming that they know, understand what the concept means.
Didn't you have another measure of that as well?
Well, that was only for abstract words.
Okay. But you also, and she also has the translation recognition and semantic priming data.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I thought they had to produce words freely or something. So
yes.
For that task specifically, they were just producing whatever they had seen before.
Well, no, because they're never trained on the concrete words.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So how can they produce those concrete words if they're never trained on them, and how do you know that they actually knew those words before or not? Because they can't come up with a word, invented on the spot. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, I think, first off, that's the whole point of the training, is that you only physically is not the right word, but you're only actively working with the abstract vocabulary.
Mhm.
And the
Exactly.
and so I think there's two things. First off, Erin can look at the baseline data from the translation recognition task to confirm that indeed there was receptive knowledge of the concrete words. But I think the more important things, we're looking really at productive vocabulary gains. And the fact is, if there is some level of base receptive knowledge, even if you don't train it, we're seeing these improvements in being able to recall and produce concrete words.
Sure, but that obviously like assumes that the participant already knows that the word for pan is pan. Because if the participant doesn't know that, they can't invent the word pan.
Right,
That's all I'm saying.
right,
That was my
So-
question too.
right.
I had this.
They have to know the word first. 'cause
Right.
that's their native
And I
language.
don't think Erin was ever making the claims otherwise.
No, sure, but that's
Okay.
just, I'm just clarifying, like, I'm not attacking her.
Okay.
All right. Richard,
I have a question about the training sessions. So when you did those, how many abstract words would you train them on, and how long would a training block last?
So it was the 15 trained abstract words within the category.
So all 15, what you would do for each block?
Yes.
Okay.
And then sessions could range from like 25 minutes to like 45 minutes, anywhere between that time. That was generally where it went from.
Just making sure all 15 got it.
Yeah, it was just, we got through all the 15 words. There was, just once they were done, that was when it would end it, but generally.
Okay.
all right. Thank you very much, Erin.